Thank you so much for being here. My apologies for rescheduling, but got a little summer flu or something. I don't know. It's kind of crazy, but I'm good now and you're going to love this story. First off, take a look at the signature in the upper right-hand corner of my first image here. That's Leonardo da Vinci's signature. And no, it's not in backwards. I'll tell you all about it in a minute, but remember what that looks like. So we're going to start by talking about Leonardo da Vinci in terms of the 10 most fascinating facts. How do you summarize Leonardo da Vinci in 1 hour? I'm going to highlight the 10 facts and then go into a little more detail. And we're going to do it kind of like Letterman used to do. Start with fact number 10. We should probably have a drum roll somewhere. I should play that in the background, but let's go ahead and get started. All right, fascinating fact number 10. Leonardo da Vinci was not a prolific painter. In fact, he left fewer than 30 paintings, and these aren't even all finished. But before you think that you can do the same and go down in art history, remember, he also left hundreds of drawings and sketches and pages of notes. His reputation isn't just based on those few paintings. Fascinating fact number 9. Leonardo da Vinci was his own worst enemy. He was both, ready for this, a perfectionist and a procrastinator. How's that for a terrible combination of personality traits? It's said to be one of the reasons why he left so few paintings. Okay, Leonardo da Vinci, fascinating fact number 8. Where's the proof? He had this keen eye and quick mind that led him to make very important scientific discoveries, and yet he never published any of his ideas. Fascinating fact number 7. If he hadn't been illegitimate, he may not have been an artist. Leonardo was born out of wedlock on the 15th of April, 1452. But if he hadn't been born out of wedlock, he might not have been apprenticed to the artist Andrea del Verrocchio, because he would have had a lot of other occupations open to him. But because he was illegitimate, his options were very limited. Fascinating fact, drum roll number 6. He was a true Renaissance man. In addition to being just about the smartest person ever, Leonardo is reported to have been strikingly handsome, with great strength and a fine singing voice. Fascinating fact number 5. He was a vegetarian, which was very unusual for the era in which he lived. He was a vegetarian for humanitarian reasons. In fact, he loved animals so much that he would often buy caged animals at the market and then set them free there. That didn't stop him, however, from dissecting humans to study anatomy and to map out where the human soul was, he said. And it didn't stop him from taking a job as a designer of deadly military weapons. That's a contradiction. Leonardo da Vinci, fascinating fact number 4. Ready? He was an ambidextrous, paranoid dyslexic. In an era when left-handedness was considered to be the devil's work, Leonardo was a southpaw, and it was suggested that this difference was an element of his genius, since his detachment allowed him to see beyond the ordinary. He would draw forward with one hand while writing backwards with the other, which people actually witnessed and documented, producing a mirror image script that others found very difficult to read, which was exactly the point. Other people actually have to use a mirror to read Leonardo da Vinci's notations, but of course he didn't need the mirror. Remember that signature I told you about? That's why he did it backwards, and he did it with his opposite hand, creating this mirror image script. Fascinating fact number 3, he was a lover of experimentation. His greatest fresco, The Last Supper, actually began to deteriorate almost immediately. And that's because Leonardo never followed the traditional tried and true tested technique of fresco, which is applying water-based paints to wet plaster. He used oil-based paint that he made himself on a surface that was a mixture of gesso and egg whites. And then the egg whites would break down and the paint would fall off the wall. Leonardo da Vinci, fascinating fact number 2. Remember when you look at the Mona Lisa later in this presentation, you call that a beauty? That lady with the smile, the most famous painting in the world? I want you to remember this. When you look closely at her face, she doesn't have eyelashes or eyebrows. Fascinating fact number 1. Do not call him Da Vinci. Despite his popularity, you're just saying that he's from Vinci. Because he was illegitimate, he didn't get a last name. So he was Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo from the town of Vinci. He remains one of the most fascinating people history has ever known. He once said, "Things of the mind left untested by the senses are useless." And he left very little untested. Yet few people know the amazing story behind the man who is often described as the embodiment of the Renaissance. So in this 1-hour presentation, allow me to only scratch the surface and introduce you to the artist, the scientific visionary, the amazing inventor, and Leonardo the man. One can never explain the existence of genius, but one can enjoy. So he was the illegitimate son of a 25-year-old notary by the name of Serpero and a peasant girl, Caterina, who possibly worked in the household of Leonardo's father. She was a young girl. Leonardo was born on April 15th, 1452 in Vinci, Italy, just outside of Florence. That's why he was called Leonardo da Vinci. His father took custody of the little fellow shortly after his birth, while his mother married someone else and moved to a neighboring town, but only for a brief time. Now, Piero and Caterina kept on having kids, although not with each other. And they eventually supplied Leonardo with 17 half-sisters and brothers. Now, what art historians don't really know is whose cradle the baby Leonardo was resting in, because documentation didn't start that early. But when he was a little older, there were notations made about his life, and he spent most of his time as a child with neither parent, but with his uncle Francesco, who was his paternal uncle, who would later write down notations about Leonardo and his upbringing, and he would eventually remember Leonardo in his will. Now, Serpero was busy in the nearby city of Florence. That was Leonardo's father. And Caterina, his young mother, married a man named Octabraggia. Francesco worked as a farmer, his uncle, and Leonardo spent a great deal of his time, his childhood, out of doors, observing nature and possibly sketching it. So Leonardo's status as an illegitimate child certainly affected his personal development. And although the upper classes usually ignored illegitimacy and allowed these children to inherit their father's property and power, the middle class was very particular about illegitimate children. Now, as a notary, Leonardo's father, Serpero, was positioned very solidly within this developing middle class, which was full of clubs and guilds and unions, and they carefully regulated all of the opportunities that were available to a young boy like Leonardo under his circumstances. So as an illegitimate child, he would never be able to attend a university or never go to school. He never could become a notary like his father. And no doubt he was neglected by his parents. Not only was he illegitimate, but his mother was distracted by her other legitimate children. And Serpero spent most of his time away from Leonardo in Florence. So, lacking anyone whose footsteps he was expected to follow, Leonardo would eventually develop freely into that universal man that he would eventually become. So he spends his days with his uncle Francesco, tending to animals, exploring the farmland, observing nature and landscapes that he would later sketch and study. And because he wasn't expected to be anything, especially not a notary, he was free to pursue drawing, which was looked on very negatively. So Serpero was a notary, and he did ensure that his son had a proper elementary education at home. He had to learn many things on his own, and he would eventually teach himself Latin, physics, and human anatomy from the books that his father would drop off to him and encourage him to study from. So he grew up in his uncle's home, where he had access to a lot of scholarly texts owned by the families, his uncle that lived there and friends of his uncle. And he was also exposed to Vinci's long-standing painting tradition. Now, when he was about 15 years old, his father apprenticed him to the renowned workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in Florence. Leonardo started an apprenticeship in this workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio in 1466. And Del Verrocchio at the time was the most gifted artist in Florence. He was a sculptor and a painter and a goldsmith. He cast in bronze. There's no doubt that Verrocchio had much influence on Leonardo. Now, Leonardo was fascinated by the drawings of his master, but the master was amazed at the work of Leonardo and eventually gave him a place in his workshop. Now, even as an apprentice, Leonardo demonstrated this colossal talent, and his genius seems to have seeped into a number of pieces that were produced by Del Verrocchio's workshop from 1470 to 1475. For example, one of Leonardo's first big breaks was to paint these two angels in this painting called The Baptism of Christ. And Leonardo was so much better than his master Del Verrocchio that apparently Del Verrocchio resolved that he would never paint again once he saw Leonardo's work. Many of young Da Vinci's paintings were so finely painted that the brush strokes are undetectable even using modern X-ray techniques. Under X-ray examination, the angel's face actually appears blank. And Del Verrocchio claimed it was because of Leonardo's skills that he eventually retired from painting. Now, Del Verrocchio's specialty was perspective, which artists had only started to get the hang of. And of course, Leonardo mastered the challenges of perspective. This is a sketch that he did when he was 16 years old. He learned so quickly that he surpassed Del Verrocchio, and by the time he was in his early 20s, he was downright famous for the way that he portrayed perspective in his paintings. Now, Renaissance Italy was centuries away from our culture of photographs and cinema, but Leonardo nevertheless sought out this universal language in painting and drawing with perspective and other realistic elements. And he said, I will try to create faithful renditions of life. Now, in a culture that was previously dominated by highly figurative and downright strange religious paintings, his desire to paint things realistically was very bold and fresh. And this call to objectivity became the standard for painters who followed in the 16th century. So he stays in Del Verrocchio's workshop until 1477, when he eventually sets up shingles for himself. Now, early on, he's looking for new challenges and big bucks, and so he enters the service of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, in 1482. And he creates his first commission in Florence called the Adoration of the Magi. He spent 17 years in Milan, leaving only after the Duke fell from power in 1499. And it was during these years that Leonardo hit his stride, reaching new heights of scientific and artistic achievement. Incidentally, the Duke had him painting portraits of his mistresses. This is one of the mistresses of the Duke that Leonardo painted for him. And the Duke kept himself busy painting these portraits of his mistresses and painting and sculpting and designing elaborate court festivals. But he also kept Leonardo busy working on and designing military weapons and machinery. So from 1485 to 1490, when Leonardo was 38 years old, he produced a number of studies on a variety of different subjects, including nature and flying machines and geometry and mechanics and municipal construction, canals, architecture. He designed everything from churches to fortresses. And his studies during this period also contained designs for advanced weapons, including a tank and other war vehicles in various combat devices, submarines, things like that. During this period, he also produced his very first anatomical studies. And his Milan workshop was this hive of activity, buzzing with apprentices and students, and they were all busy helping Leonardo with these numerous ideas that he had. It was during this time that he first created the first drawings of an embryo. Now, he went beyond his teaching by making these scientific studies of light and shadow in nature. And it dawned on him when he was creating these sketches that objects were not comprised of just outlines, but were actually three-dimensional bodies defined by light and shadow. Now, known as chiaroscuro, this technique of light and shadow gave his paintings this soft, lifelike quality that made older paintings look kind of cartoony and flat. And he saw that an object's detail and color change as it reduced into the distance. That was the definition of this idea of chiaroscuro, or creating this three-dimensional effect. But that technique of having it fade into the distance is called sfumato. Incidentally, here's that close-up of the Mona Lisa. Take a look at her. No eyebrows, no eyelashes. So sfumato in Italian means to tone down or to evaporate like smoke. And it's derived from the Italian word fumo, meaning smoke. And Leonardo described sfumato as without lines or borders in the manner of smoke. Incidentally, the style was originally developed by a Flemish painter, and then a Venetian painter also used this technique. But of course, the super genius Leonardo transformed this idea into a powerful tool, creating atmosphere and depth that was visible in these paintings that he created, nothing like anybody had ever seen before. He is ever the perfectionist, and he also turned to science in his quest for improving his artwork. And his study of nature and anatomy emerged into these stunningly realistic paintings. And he did that by dissecting the human body, which helped him pave the way towards remarkably accurate figures. He was the first person to study the physical proportions of men and women and children, and to use those studies to determine the ideal human figure. Now, this scientific definition of the Vitruvian Man was something that was expressed before Leonardo da Vinci, but Leonardo da Vinci took it to paper and actually drew the designs of it. And you can see his notations in the back. Of course, you can't read them because they're backwards, going from right to left, and you would need a mirror to see that. But he was the first one to actually illustrate the idea of the Vitruvian Man. Now, if we were together right now, I'd have one of you come up front and and measure this. For example, see if this holds true. The palm of your hand is the width of 4 fingers, and the length of a man's foot is 1/6 of his height. And the length of a man's outspread arms is the same as his height. And I would have somebody come down on the ground and we would measure. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't have you do that. Anyway, these remarkably accurate figures have this scientific definition. Now, unlike many of his contemporaries, Michelangelo, for example, he didn't get carried away painting these muscular bodies in such a dramatic fashion like Michelangelo. Incidentally, Leonardo referred to Michelangelo's paintings of people as an image of a bag of nuts. All in all, Leonardo believed that an artist must know not just the rules of perspective, but also the laws of nature. And he said the eye, he believed, was the perfect instrument for learning these laws, and the artist was the perfect person to illustrate them. I threw this in here because it's just such a fascinating observation here. There are experts who are studying some of Leonardo da Vinci's so-called paintings and finding out through something that they're calling the Daffodil Code that some of the paintings that have been passed off as original Leonardo da Vinci paintings are actually not. For example, the Louvre, the Virgin of the Rocks that was supposedly painted between 1483 and 1490 is this complex geological landscape where you can actually see the formation of some of these elements that grew, botanical elements that grew there. London's National Gallery version of the Virgin of the Rocks that came out in 1508, you can actually tell that it's not a Da Vinci because there are invented plants that bear no resemblance to reality. The perspective is wrong, and Leonardo da Vinci would never let something like that be recorded. So anyway, when you get a chance and you have nothing to do, take a look at the Daffodil Code. It's very interesting how they're analyzing what's really a Da Vinci and what's not. So during this time, he believed that he needed to learn the laws of nature. And his interests became so broad that he was often compelled to create new subjects, and he never really finished what he started, like this one is an unfinished Da Vinci, the Virgin and Child. And this lack of stick-to-itiveness came from the fact that he was a perfectionist and a procrastinator. And that resulted in him completing only about 6 works in 17 years. He left dozens of paintings and projects unfinished or unrealized. He spent a lot of his time studying science, either by going out to nature and observing things or by locking himself away in his workshop, cutting up bodies, pondering the termination of the soul and universal truth by looking at the inside of our bodies. Now, between 1490 and 1495, when he was between 38 and 43 years old, he developed a habit of recording his studies in these meticulously illustrated notebooks. And his work covered 4 main themes: painting, architecture, the elements of mechanics, and human anatomy. And these studies and sketches were collected into various codices and manuscripts, which are now hungrily collected by museums and individuals like Bill Gates, who recently plunked down $30 million for one of the codices. Incidentally, he has 350 people with mirrors just interpreting the words, not even translating it, but just getting the words from backwards to forwards so that we can read them, and then having other people analyze what the words are. And a lot of the questions that he put down in these codices were things like, why is the sky blue? How does a heart function? What are the differences in air pressure above and beneath a bird's wing? how will this knowledge enable a man to possibly fly or make a flying machine? So he would describe what sneezing is, for example, or what yawning is, or what becoming sick, or a spasm, or paralysis, or what it means when you're shivering with cold, sweating, fatigue, hunger, sleep, thirst. You can imagine why he never finished anything, because the ideas went on and on. And he intended to produce these publications, but he never really got around to it. There was always something more to learn. In the following centuries, at least half of the pages of these codices were lost, and what survives is an unparalleled record of a human mind at work, fearless and brilliant and very impulsive. He told us more about the world than ever seemed possible, and next to nothing about himself, incidentally. So let's go back to Milan. These are some of the illustrations that he did after taking apart cadavers, for example. All right, back to Milan. After the invasion by the French and Ludovico Sforza's fall from power in 1499, Leonardo was left to search for a new patron. Over the next several years, 16 years, Leonardo worked and traveled throughout Italy for a number of employers, including the dastardly Caesar Borgia, and that's this man here. He traveled for a year with Borgia's army as a military engineer, and he even met Niccolo Machiavelli, who was the author of The Prince, and actually helped him with some of the observations in this book. He also, during this time, designed a bridge to span the Golden Horn in Constantinople. During this period, he received a commission to help, with the help of Machiavelli, to paint the Battle of Angari. Now, about 1503, he started working on the Mona Lisa. On July 9, 1504, he receives notice that his father died, and through the sinister acts of his meddling half-brothers and sisters, he was deprived of any inheritance. The death of his uncle also resulted in this scuffle over his inheritance, but by this time, Leonardo beat out his scheming siblings and wound up with the use of his uncle's land and his money. From 1513 to 1516, he worked in Rome and he maintained a workshop. He undertook a number of projects for the Pope. He continued his studies of human anatomy and physiology, but the Pope eventually stopped him from dissecting cadavers, which kind of cramped his style. Now, following the death of Giuliano de' Medici in March of 1516, he was eventually offered the title of Premier Painter and Engineer and Architect of the King by King Francis I of France. That was probably his last and, well, not probably, certainly his last and most generous patron. Francis I provided Leonardo with a cushy job, including a stipend at a manor house near the royal chateau at Amboise. Now, although during this time he suffered from a paralysis of his right hand, he was still able to draw and teach. And he produced a number of studies of the Virgin Mary during this time, and also created studies of cats and horses and dragons, anatomical studies, studies of nature and water, and a variety of different machines. So let's take a look at Leonardo the scientist. He bridged the gap between the shockingly unscientific medieval methods and a new approach, which is now our new trusty modern approach to study. And his experiments in anatomy and the study of fluids, for example, absolutely blew away the accomplishments of his predecessors. Beginning with his first stay in Milan and accelerating around 1505, Leonardo became more and more wrapped up in scientific investigations. And the sheer range of topics that came under his inquiry is staggering. from anatomy to zoology, botany, geology, optics, aerodynamics, and hydrodynamics. And while greatly influenced by the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, unlike his contemporaries, Leonardo saw the limitations of seeking the truth only from the writings in the Bible. And instead, he took this startling approach of actually observing nature and asking deceptively simple questions like, how do birds fly? And then to finish the bill, he systematically recorded the solutions in his sketches. And in addition to making notations, he had drawings. He had this uncanny ability to observe nature and then record it. And then that added to his spooky determination, made him cover all different kinds of subjects. The first biographer of Leonardo da Vinci, Paolo Giove, wrote in 1520, in the medical faculty, Leonardo learned to dissect the cadavers of criminals under inhumane, disgusting conditions because he wanted to examine and draw the different deflections and reflections of the limbs and their dependence on the nerves and joints. This is why he paid attention to all forms of even small organs, capillaries, and hidden parts of the skeleton. Now, for example, in his study of the vertebrae, he sees it from different perspectives, and former and contemporary authors had all produced tormentingly long-winded and very confusing descriptions. However, the concise portrayal from different perspectives with kind of a pinpoint definition, he was able to teach you a little bit more about the study of scientific things through his writings and his illustrations. Now curiosity took him in other directions, even wilder directions, and he would use this idea of scientific inquiry that we still use today. Close observation, repeated testing of the observation, precise illustration of the subject or object or phenomenon, and then explanatory notes. And the results were volumes of remarkable notes in a variety of different topics, from the nature of the sun and moon and stars to the formation of fossils, the mysteries of flight. And his ideas about perpetual motion, incidentally, were a precursor to what Newton had concluded 2 centuries later, incidentally, in his first law of motion. And then there's Da Vinci's remarkable insight into how the heart's aortic valve worked. It took people who studied anatomy until the 1960s, 450 years later, to say that he was absolutely correct in his observation and his notation. Even Leonardo, however, fell for some bogus theories like physiognomy, which is the study of evaluating a person's character by his or her facial features. Obviously, it wasn't true, but it was all the rage until the beginning of the century, and then scientists eventually chucked it for once and for all. Let's take a look at Leonardo the inventor. Artists always found it difficult to make a living just with their art, and even masters like Leonardo was forced to sell out in order to support himself. So he adapted his drawing skills to the more lucrative field of architecture and military engineering and weapons design. And although he was a peacemaker at heart, he did land a job working for the Duke of Milan by calling himself a military engineer and outlining some of the most sinister ideas for weapons and fortifications. He only briefly mentioned to the Duke that he could paint, and when he did, he had him painting pictures of his mistresses. Lucky for Leonardo, he was actually talented as an engineer, and good illustrators were a dime a dozen in Renaissance Italy at the time, but Leonardo had the brains and the diligence to break new ground, and so he left his contemporaries in the dust. Now, he wanted to create new machines for the new world. And this is a list of some of the things that Leonardo invented that we still use today. For example, the design of the scissors originally came from an idea that Leonardo had. The first parachute, first contact lens, the plans for outlining the construction of a helicopter that he called a helical air screw. The monkey wrench is still the same design that Leonardo invented years and years ago. The rotisserie oven. This is my favorite one. The early alarm clock that woke you up by gently rubbing your feet. Wouldn't that be better than that annoying sound that comes from your phone? Throughout his life, he had these brilliant and far out ideas. And like most of his great ideas, most of the engineers around the time squelched his ideas until they realized how actually accurate he was. Centuries before Galileo, he was starting to butt heads with the challenge of measuring time. And for him, the most interesting part of that was the idea of using mechanical gears. And based on the gear, he came up with a number of different inventions like a helicopter, an automobile, and the bicycle. Look at that design. That's an original Leonardo da Vinci line design. Looks a little familiar. His biggest bee in his bonnet, mechanical bee in his bonnet, was water. And no one had harnessed any electricity yet. So water was the source of power. And he studied all forms of water, liquid, steam, ice. He had all kind of crazy ideas of what he could do with water, measuring humidity, a steam-powered cannon, water wheels, and all kinds of industrial machines that were all powered by flowing water. He even devised some highly ambitious plans to revitalize Milan with canals, which were intended to be implemented with these equally ambitious construction machines that he also invented. In fact, once he started on the subject of water, he never could really stop, and he envisioned things like floating snowshoes to walk on water, or breathing devices, including a diving hood and webbed gloves to explore the underwater. He also invented a life preserver to remain afloat that looked mysteriously like a donut, which we still use today. Also invented an unsinkable double-hulled ship, and a variety of different things, machines for clearing harbors and channels. How about Leonardo the Musician? There's a lot of truth to the fact that he was a skilled poet, singer, and a practicing musician. And he would take these instruments and improve on them to make them sound better. He worked on the mechanization of the hurdy-gurdy. He improved the mechanics for keyboards so they would be easier to play. He enhanced the tonal quality of a number of different instruments. From 1513 to 1516, he spent his time living in Rome, where Raphael and Michelangelo were both active at the time. And eventually in 1516, he enters Francois' service, and he was invited to live near the king's residence at the Royal Chateau Amboise. And it was here that he spent his last 3 years of his life, supported by a pension. Leonardo died May 2nd, 1519, at the age of 67. And incidentally, King Francis was at his side when he died, cradling Leonardo in his arms. In his last days, Leonardo sent for a priest to make his confession to, and to receive the holy sacraments. And according to his will, 60 beggars followed his casket. He was buried in the chapel of Saint Hubert, and on the grounds of the castle of Amboise. And this is what art historians said about Leonardo at the time. The most heavenly gifts seem to be showered on certain human beings. Sometimes supernaturally, marvelously, they all congregate on one individual. And this was seen and acknowledged by all men in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, who had an indescribable grace in every effortless act and deed. His talent was so rare that he mastered any subject to which he turned his attention. He might have been a scientist had he been not so versatile. That was written about him around the time that he died. So let's take a look at that beauty with no eyebrows. The title Mona Lisa stems from Giorgio Vasari's biography of Leonardo da Vinci that was published 31 years after Leonardo's death. And he identifies the sitter as Lisa, the wife of a wealthy Florentine businessman by the name of Francesco del Giocondo. So sometimes she is known as La Gioconda. Mona, M-O-N-A, is a common Italian contradiction for Madonna, meaning my lady or madam. And eventually she was called Madam Lisa. And eventually Mona Lisa, M-O-N-N-A, and more famously La Gioconda, which also means the lighthearted one. So Mona Lisa and La Gioconda were the established titles for the painting in the 19th century. And before that was established, they would refer to the painting as the painting of a certain Florentine lady in a gauze veil. So he began painting Mona in 1503, and he completed it 4 years later. And he takes the painting from Italy to France in 1516, and he gives it to King Francois in return for the equivalent of about $128,000, which would be the money that he would use to continue operating his workshop. So it was kind of a trade-off. After Leonardo's death, Francois had this painting in his basement and didn't know what to do with it. And he thought he should probably hang it somewhere in the main part of his castle. But there was nowhere that was big enough to hold this painting, so he had it cut down. And he had panels on the sides removed, and there were originally columns on the sides, and you could actually see her from the knees down, all the way down to the bottom of her skirt and where her shoes were. And the reason we know this is because we see a lot of sketches that were done of the Mona Lisa, and we know this painting was bigger. King Francois also commented that he cut it off on 3 sides. So the painting eventually winds up in his main area of his home, but it was not well known until the mid-19th century when artists emerging from the symbolist movement began to appreciate it and started associating her with the ideals of the feminine mystique. Now, the painting's increasing fame was further emphasized when it was actually stolen in 1911. And this is how the story goes. That morning, many museum employees noticed that the painting was not hanging in its usual place, but they assumed that the painting was taken off the wall by a museum photographer who was shooting pictures of it up in the studio. By Tuesday morning, when it still wasn't back, and they talked to the photographer and he said he hadn't taken any pictures, the museum's officials were notified. The painting was gone. The police were contacted immediately. They set up headquarters in the museum curator's office, and the museum was searched from top to bottom, which took a week because of the size of the Louvre. It's a 49-acre building, and it runs along the Seine River for 2,200 feet. The only thing that the detectives found was this heavy frame that once held the Mona Lisa painting, and it was discarded in a staircase leading to a cloakroom. Now, once the news became public, French newspapers made several claims as to the nature of the theft, and the painting was gone. So police questioned a famous artist, Pablo Picasso. He had previously bought stolen paintings in the past. He actually stole pieces himself from the Louvre, and people would look the other way. But they thought at this time, Picasso definitely stole this painting because he didn't want to be measured by this painting. So fearful of any implications of bad publicity, Picasso eventually gave back the stuff that he had stolen and the paintings and items, sculptures that he had bought from other people who had stolen things, and eventually answered all the questions of the police. They kept him overnight, but eventually he was released. He didn't know anything about the Mona Lisa. Luckily, the painting was rediscovered 27 months after it was stolen. An Italian man by the name of Vincenzo Perugia actually tried to sell the original to a gallery in Florence for $100,000. And Perugia claimed that he stole the work out of patriotism. He didn't think a work by a famous Italian should be kept in France. But what he didn't realize was that while the Mona Lisa was painted in Italy, Leonardo took it with him to France and sold it to the king. So how did Perugia steal the Mona Lisa? Well, this is how he did it. He spent Sunday night in the Louvre. He hid in an obscure little room. And Monday morning, when the museum was closed, he entered the room where the painting was, unhooked it from the wall, and went, and it was on a frame that kind of held it against the wall so that it wouldn't fall. He cut the painting from its frame, and when he tried to leave the building, he came to a locked door. So he unscrewed the doorknob, put the doorknob in his pocket, and walked out of the Louvre with the painting under his coat. Interestingly, 10 months before the painting was stolen, the Louvre had decided to have all of the masterpieces put under glass, and Perugia was one of the foremen assigned to the job, and he made sure that the glass was loose so that he could get to it. He was planning it for quite a while. Now, how this started originally and who gave the idea to Perugia was a con man by the name of Edoardo Valferno. He's the one who masterminded all this. And he had commissioned a French art forger by the name of Yves Chaudron to make copies of the painting so that when Perugia walked out of the building, he would give it to this forger. He would make all these copies, sell them all over before anybody realized that they were forgeries. But he didn't need the original anymore. So Perugia had the original still, and he kept the original in his apartment for 2 years between his mattresses. Now, Perugia got very impatient and decided he was going to sell it to an art dealer and make the money on himself, and that's when he was discovered. That was 1913. Now, in 1956, the lower part of the painting was severely damaged when someone doused it with acid. And then several months later, someone threw a stone at it, and now it's covered by security glass. And prior to the 1962-1963 tour, the painting was assessed for insurance purposes at $100 million, but now it's insured for $608 million. This is Perugia, who wound up obviously in jail. And April 6th, 2005, the painting was moved to a new home in the museum's Salle d'Etat. And it's displayed in a purpose-built, climate-controlled, enclosed environment behind unbreakable, bulletproof, non-reflective glass. You can't even get close to it. And besides that, all the people in the whole first section are just taking pictures of it. So you're blinded and you can't see anything. There's so many people around. I don't know if anybody's ever gone and tried to see the Mona Lisa. So you call this a beauty. Some claim that her lack of eyebrows is representative of high-class fashion at the time, but I'm going to tell you what the real truth is. Her missing eyebrows are proof that it's an unfinished masterpiece. In 2007, there is a detailed scan of the painting that revealed that Da Vinci painted on one side of the eyebrows and put in bold eyelashes, but the paint was so thick that it started falling off of the canvas. And many years later, even the parts that he had painted weren't there, but you can see the lines of where the paint was. How about another painting where the paint is actually falling off of this masterpiece? The Last Supper is one of Leonardo's best known and worst preserved pieces. It's painted on dry wall rather than plaster, so it's not really a fresco. And because the fresco could not be modified, he instead decided to seal the stone with a layer of pitch and gesso and mastic so that he could paint on it with tempera and then change it as he wanted to. But the method he used did not withstand the test of time. And shortly after he started painting it, only a few years later, in early 1517, the painting was starting to flake and fall off. In 1556, less than 60 years after it was finished, it was actually ruined, and it was deteriorated so bad that the figures were unrecognizable. Then in 1652, see that doorway on the bottom? That was cut through the then unrecognizable painting because they wanted to use the room that was on the opposite side of this wall. The painting was already gone and unrecognizable, so they just cut right through it. That's that irregular shape, arch shape that's at the bottom of this painted wall. In 1768, they decided to hang a curtain over the painting to protect it, but instead it trapped moisture on the surface, and whenever the curtain was pulled back, it scratched off the flaking paint. The first restoration was attempted in 1726, who filled in the missing pieces with oil paint and then varnished over the whole mural, making it not even anywhere near anything that Leonardo da Vinci had created. And then another restoration was attempted in 1770 by Giuseppe Mazza. Eventually, Mazza stripped off all of Bellotti's work and then repainted the painting, but he did it so badly that the public asked him to stop. Within 50 years, it was unrecognizable and undecipherable, and it was repainted twice during the 18th century. Italian conservators opted for a radical approach, and instead of trying to patch what was left on there and what other people tried to paint, they decided to scrape away everything. And what was left was the stain on the wall from the original painting that Da Vinci had painted. After removing the paint, did we discover that there were features on the faces that weren't on the painting once it was redesigned. We also noticed that the position of the eyes had been altered, mouths that were partially open were closed, beards that Leonardo never painted were added, hands were elongated, the actual dimensions of the heads themselves were changed. This is the only original sketches that were done by Leonardo to actually see what these characters look like in the painting. So the bad news is that less than 20% of the original paint is left on the wall. So when you take a look at the Last Supper, and Rick Steve talks to you about this, and you're touring around, you get the feeling that maybe this isn't really a Leonardo da Vinci original. Many art historians said they should have left the old paint on. They destroyed the historical continuity of the painting. It's not his original paint. There's been so many modifications to it. And to fill things in, it's impossible to do. So art historians said it's probably better to see less than 20% of Leonardo's original than look at what we see here up on the wall. But let's take a look now at the fraud of the century, and that's Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi that sold at Christie's for $450 million, becoming the most expensive work of art ever sold at the time. We've broken those records. That was in 2011. Not so long ago, an eagle-eyed buyer purchased this painting for $120 at an auction house. So how did we get from $120 to $450 million? I'm going to give you the concise version. In the late 1970, this is 2 years summarized, 200 years summarized. In the late 19th century, the painting enters the collection of the Virginia-based Sir Frederick Cook. And in 1958, it pops up at Sotheby's London auction house, 1958, and someone bought it for $120. They thought it was done by an artist who studied under Leonardo da Vinci by the name of Boltraffio. And Boltraffio was documented to have worked under Leonardo da Vinci. So this was thought to be a Boltraffio painting, and that's why it sold for $120. In 2005, the canvas surfaces again at an American estate sale, and a New York art dealer, Alexander Parrish, purchased it for $10,000, another bargain price. Well, it was mangled by repainting attempts made by former owners. The walnut panel was cracked. It was suspected that there was something there before the restorers started changing it. And the owners of it now spent the next 6 years restoring it to prove that it was some kind of a masterpiece, and thought that if they could pass it off as something not by one of Leonardo's students, but by Leonardo da Vinci himself, they might be able to sell it for $150 million to one of their biggest clients, who was a Swiss art dealer. It turns out that the Swiss art dealer worked for a Russian billionaire, and he didn't just buy the painting and then hand it over to his client. He bought it and then asked for another $127 million for it. So the Russian, who eventually forked over the money, was surprised when he found out that there were not a lot of works of art bought from this art dealer that were actually real originals, and that he had spent a great deal of money on this, buying paintings from this dealer that were probably not worth the money that he paid for them. So he puts together an investigation, finds out about this painting, and thinks maybe this actually is an original. So he sells it, this Russian billionaire, to another collector in 2017. I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong date, for $450 million, not even knowing whether it was really a Da Vinci or not, but wanting to get his money back from being swindled by the other art dealer. And who'd he sell it to? Arab princes. They're buying an awful lot of artwork. They have a lot of originals from museums, where museums, incidentally, are hiring forgers to recreate the paintings that they're selling to these United Arab Emirates princes. And it was bought by them for $450 million, not really knowing whether it was an actual Da Vinci or not. Well, they come to find out that it had been painted over and over so many times that it wasn't the original. And not only did they lose their money, but they never really displayed it anywhere. I just put this little quote in: "It's restored, it sells, and therefore it is." Is that true? Well, we don't really know. Ultimately, the call to question, the question to ask is, how much of the conservation work actually remains on this picture, and how much of it is Da Vinci, if it actually remains Da Vinci. Incidentally, you never see it displayed anywhere, because I think restorers and historians have come to find out that it's not an original Da Vinci. My apologies for going over.
Go ahead, you're doing fine.
The last words of Leonardo da Vinci were documented, and he said, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality that it should have." Kind of a sad testament for a man who was dying and left such a remarkable legacy. Incidentally, this is one of the pictures that we have at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which is never displayed. Many art historians, especially in the Cleveland area, are constantly petitioning the Cleveland Museum to get this out of the archives and get it displayed again. The reason they haven't displayed it is there's some question as to whether it's really a Da Vinci or not. Anyway, that's the story of Leonardo da Vinci. Thank you for your time, and I guess we'll answer some questions if anybody has any.
I do have a question here. Have you heard by some who say that Mona Lisa is possibly a Da Vinci self-portrait of his own face?
Yeah, I don't really have that documented. Many art historians don't believe that at all. Kind of a story that's come up through the years. And Leonardo da Vinci documented everything, and there's no indication at all that he ever created a self-portrait, let alone one to look like a woman. And we could make anything true, I guess, but no, I don't believe that's true. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope I answered some questions. I like to teach you 5 new things, so hopefully you learned 5 new things tonight. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Go sit out on your porch. It's absolutely beautiful, and dream of whether any of the paintings that we have in the museums are real Da Vinci's. There's a lot of research going on right now to figure out if they are.
I definitely learned some new things. I think I learned at least 5 new things.
Perfect. And I reached my goal. Thank you. Thanks so much.